out there and vote. I commend that, and I just tell a lot of people to go out there and vote since we need it.
In a media landscape where athletes increasingly use their platforms for political expression, WNBA rookie Angel Reese has emerged as one of sport's most outspoken voices. The Chicago Sky forward, nicknamed the Bayou Barbie during her championship run at LSU, recently stirred controversy with pointed criticism of the newly inaugurated Trump administration's policies during her appearance on the popular Unapologetically Speaking podcast. Reese, who has never shied away from speaking her mind both on and off the court, delivered what many observers are calling her most politically charged commentary to date, addressing issues ranging from education funding to women's rights. "I'm not just here to dribble a basketball," Reese stated during the hour-long interview. "As someone with this platform, I have a responsibility to speak up about issues that affect my community." The podcast episode, which has already garnered millions of views across platforms, featured Reese discussing her concerns about the direction of federal education policy. "When I see proposals to reduce funding for public education and after-school programs like the ones that shaped me growing up in Baltimore, I can't stay silent," she explained. "These programs are lifelines for kids in neighborhoods like mine." The basketball star's comments have drawn predictable battle lines in today's polarized political environment. Supporters praise her willingness to leverage her celebrity status for advocacy, while critics suggest athletes should stick to sports rather than venture into political territory. The social media reaction has been swift and divided, with the hashtag #ReeseSpeak trending as fans and detractors alike weigh in on her comments. Political commentators from across the spectrum have offered their own interpretations of the significance of Reese's statements. Sources close to the White House suggest the president was reportedly displeased with the characterization of his administration's policies, though no official response has been issued. When reached for comment, White House press secretary stated only that the president respects Americans' right to free speech, including those of public figures and athletes. For Reese, this outspokenness represents a continuation of her established willingness to address issues beyond basketball. During her collegiate career at LSU, she frequently spoke about gender disparities in sports coverage and opportunity. As a professional, she has expanded her advocacy to include broader social and political concerns. What makes Reese's commentary particularly notable is that she's doing this at the very beginning of her professional career, noted sports analyst Marcus Thompson. Many athletes wait until they're well established before taking political positions, but she's showing that the newer generation of sports stars isn't waiting for permission to speak out. Fellow WNBA players have largely rallied around Reese, with several veterans of the league praising her willingness to use her platform. "When I entered the league, we were often discouraged from being too political," said three-time WNBA champion Diana Taurasi. "It's refreshing to see young players like Angel refusing to separate their identities as athletes from their identities as citizens." The podcast appearance comes at a time when Reese's star continues to rise both on and off the court. After a stellar rookie season that saw her break several rebounding records, she has secured major endorsement deals with fashion and athletic brands looking to connect with her growing fan base. Sports marketing experts suggest that Reese's outspokenness may actually enhance her brand in the long run. "Today's consumers, particularly younger ones, want authenticity from their sports heroes," explained sports marketing consultant Rebecca Chen. "They respond positively to athletes who stand for something beyond their sport." The Unapologetically Speaking podcast, hosted by former NBA player Marcus Williams, has become known for providing athletes a comfortable space to discuss topics beyond their respective sports. Previous episodes have featured conversations about racial justice, economic inequality, and the responsibilities of celebrity. "What Angel did in that studio was bring her whole self to the conversation," Williams said in a follow-up segment. "She didn't compartmentalize her identity as an athlete separate from her concerns as a citizen, and that's what made the discussion so compelling." Reese's willingness to engage in political discourse follows a path blazed by athletes like Muhammad Ali, Billie Jean King, and more recently, Colin Kaepernick and LeBron James. Each faced criticism for speaking out on issues beyond their sports, yet each ultimately helped reshape public expectations about the role athletes can play in social and political conversations. There's a rich history of athlete activism in this country, noted sports historian Dr. Amina Johnson. What we're seeing with Reese isn't new in concept, but it reflects how today's digital media landscape amplifies these voices in ways previous generations of outspoken athletes couldn't access. The Chicago Sky organization released a brief statement supporting their players' right to express personal views, while clarifying that Reese's opinions are her own and don't represent official team positions. As Reese prepares for her sophomore WNBA season, it remains unclear how her growing profile as both an athlete and activist will evolve. What seems certain is that she has no intention of separating her basketball prowess from her political convictions. But I'm also here to use whatever influence I have to speak up for what I believe is right. I can't and won't separate those parts of myself just to make people comfortable. Whether her recent comments represent the beginning of a more focused political advocacy campaign or simply reflect her characteristic forthrightness, Angel Reese has once again demonstrated that today's athletes are increasingly willing to risk controversy in service of their convictions. For a sports world still navigating the boundaries between athletic achievement and political expression, Reese's outspoken approach may well represent the new normal rather than the exception. The post-election comments that basketball star Angel Reese made following Donald Trump's victory in the 2024 presidential election set the stage for her more recent podcast appearance where she directly criticized the newly inaugurated president's policies. What began as social media expressions of dismay evolved into a comprehensive critique that ignited both backlash and support across the political spectrum. In the immediate aftermath of the November 2024 election, Reese had taken to social media with posts expressing her disappointment. "Woke up speechless," she wrote in one post that quickly went viral. In another message that drew particular attention, she stated, "I'm so disappointed in America," followed by additional commentary suggesting some voters had selfishly put their pride aside when casting their ballots. These initial reactions came during a period when many celebrities were processing the unexpected election results. Trump had secured what analysts described as a landslide victory, gaining unprecedented support among minority voters, including approximately 45% of Hispanic voters and 20% of Black voters, representing what political analysts called a seismic shift in voting patterns. The election results had surprised many political observers, with Trump's victory defying numerous pre-election polls. Analysts later attributed this polling error to what they called the shy Trump voter phenomenon, supporters who kept their voting intentions private until Election Day. As one commentator explained, a lot of Trump supporters just weren't talking to pollsters. They kept their opinions to themselves until they got to the voting booth. While Reese's initial reaction concentrated on her personal disappointment with the election outcome, her recent appearance on the Unapologetically Speaking podcast hosted by Marcus Williams represented a more substantive evolution of her political commentary. During the hour-long interview, Reese transitioned from expressions of personal disappointment to specific policy critiques. "When I see proposals to reduce funding for public education and after-school programs like the ones that shaped me growing up in Baltimore, I can't stay silent," Reese had stated during the podcast. "These programs are lifelines for kids in neighborhoods like mine." The podcast appearance, which garnered millions of views, showcased a more policy-focused approach compared to her initial post-election reactions. Reese specifically addressed economic policies that she perceived as overwhelmingly benefiting the wealthiest Americans, while vital community services in places like my hometown face cuts. Her comments about women's healthcare access during the podcast represented a significant expansion of her political messaging, as she connected her personal experiences fighting for equity in women's sports to broader policy concerns. As someone who's fought for equity in sports my entire career, I can't separate that fight from the broader struggle for women's autonomy and healthcare rights, she explained. A central tension in the public reaction to Reese's commentary involved the perceived disconnect between identity-based political appeals and economic realities. Critics pointed to Reese's apparent frustration that voters didn't focus on gender or race when casting their ballots, while exit polls showed economic concerns had dominated voter priorities. People should not be voted in because they're a woman, and supposedly, and I said supposedly, a person of color, one critic said in response to Reese's comments. This sentiment was echoed by others who argued that voters had prioritized economic concerns over representational politics. The Harris campaign had made history by featuring the first woman of color as a major party presidential nominee, but this historic aspect had seemingly been overshadowed by economic anxieties. As one commentator put it, voters were looking for more than just representation. They wanted someone who could connect with them, someone who understood their struggles. The reaction to Reese's political commentary followed predictable partisan lines. Critics of her statements pointed to the economic factors that had driven many voters to support Trump, including concerns about inflation, high food prices, elevated mortgage rates, and the overall cost of living. It wasn't pride, it was high gas prices, high food prices, high mortgage rates, car loans, house prices, and so much more, one critic noted in response to Reese's commentary. Others suggested she was disconnected from the economic realities facing everyday Americans. People can't afford a loaf of bread and eggs right now while you go out there and talk about how much money you make and all your sponsorships. Some responses to Reese's comments were particularly harsh, with one commenter suggesting she should consider playing basketball in Russia, making a reference to Brittany Griner's previous detention in that country. Another commenter wrote, "Trump winning was the best thing for y'all. Y'all don't have to worry about getting dunked on by a man in the WF." The Chicago area, where Reese plays professionally for the Sky, had been surprisingly competitive in the election, with Trump performing better in traditionally Democratic strongholds than previous Republican candidates. Have you seen Illinois, how close it got? Did you see Chicago, Angel, where you played WNBA basketball? One commentator asked rhetorically, suggesting that even Reese's home city had shown increased support for Trump. Supporters of Reese, however, praised her willingness to speak out on issues beyond basketball. Fellow WNBA players rallied around her, with three-time champion Diana Taurasi stating, "When I entered the league, we were often discouraged from being too political. It's refreshing to see young players like Angel refusing to separate their identities as athletes from their identities as citizens." The backdrop to Reese's comments was a heated national conversation about economic policy. Trump's campaign had successfully focused on what his supporters called kitchen table issues, emphasizing putting more money in people's pockets, a message that resonated strongly with voters, feeling the pressure of inflation. Multiple commentators noted that while Reese and other celebrities focused on issues of identity and representation, many voters had prioritized economic concerns. People aren't voting with their hearts, they're voting with their wallets, one analysis explained. When you're worried about how you're going to pay your bills, abstract concepts take a backseat to cold, hard economic reality. The economic anxiety that shaped the election was palpable in voter testimonials. We're talking about everyday items like bread and eggs becoming a luxury for some families, one commentator noted. Others described the difficult choices facing many Americans. Imagine having to choose between putting food on the table or keeping a roof over your head. That's the reality for some families right now. Reese's comments contributed to a broader narrative about celebrity disconnection from everyday economic struggles. Multiple critics suggested that her perspective as a successful professional athlete had isolated her from the financial pressures facing average Americans. British comedian Ricky Gervais' comments from years earlier resurfaced in this context. "If you do win an award tonight, don't use it as a platform to make a political speech. You're in no position to lecture the public about anything. You know nothing about the real world." This sentiment was echoed by those who suggested Reese's focus on identity politics missed the economic realities driving voter decisions. "Angel, we did our job by voting," one critic commented, suggesting that Reese was out of touch with everyday American concerns. The election had featured what analysts described as unprecedented voter participation, particularly in rural areas and suburbs, with some counties reporting over 80% voter turnout. This high participation rate was interpreted by many as a manifestation of the silent majority making its voice heard. British comedian Ricky Gervais' comments from years earlier resurfaced in this context. "If you do win an award tonight, don't use it as a platform to make a political speech. You're in no position to lecture the public about anything. You know nothing about the real world." This sentiment was echoed by those who suggested Reese's focus on identity politics missed the economic realities driving voter decision. "Angel, we did our job by voting," one critic commented, suggesting that Reese was out of touch with everyday American concerns. The election had featured what analysts described as unprecedented voter participation, particularly in rural areas and suburbs, with some counties reporting over 80% voter turnout. This high participation rate was interpreted by many as a manifestation of the silent majority making its voice heard. "The silent majority spoke up in a big way on Election Day," one commentator noted. This dynamic was seen as particularly significant given that pre-election polls had failed to capture the extent of Trump's support, with many voters apparently concealing their voting intentions from pollsters. Reese's evolution from emotional post-election reactions to more substantive policy critiques during her podcast appearance reflected a broader shift in political dialogue. While her initial comments had focused on disappointment that voters didn't prioritize gender and racial representation, her podcast appearance demonstrated a more nuanced approach to discussing policy implications. Political analysts noted that Reese's more recent commentary targeted specific policy positions rather than engaging in personal attacks, showing growth in her approach to political advocacy. She was substantive in her criticisms, noted political commentator Jamila Rodriguez. This wasn't just vague opposition. She came prepared with examples and concerns grounded in her own experiences and community connections. In her initial post-election social media activity, Reese had referenced her faith, writing, "God is the best author and the best finisher. I'm just going to pray on this and think positive." This spiritual dimension added another layer to her political commentary, reflecting the complex intersection of faith, politics, and personal values that shaped many Americans' reactions to the election results. During her podcast appearance, Reese expanded on this spiritual framework, suggesting that her advocacy was informed by her moral convictions. "I can't and won't separate those parts of myself just to make people comfortable," she explained, referring to both her athletic identity and her political beliefs. Immigration policy emerged as another point of contention between Reese's perspective and that of Trump supporters. Critics of Reese's position emphasized border security concerns, with one commenter stating, "We want the most qualified candidate. We don't want people streaming across the border illegally." This immigration speakered criticism connected to broader debates about national security and economic opportunity that had featured prominently in campaign messaging. During her podcast appearance, Reese addressed these concerns by emphasizing the human impact of immigration policies, particularly on communities of color. The controversy surrounding Reese's political commentary highlighted ongoing questions about the role of athletes in political discourse. Some critics maintained that athletes should stick to sports, while others viewed Reese as continuing a tradition of athlete activism that included figures like Muhammad Ali, Billie Jean King, Colin Kaepernick, and LeBron James.